And thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Christopher, for putting together an incredibly topical and terrific series. Panelists, come on out. You will not be introduced until later. Right. So go ahead, yeah, and take a seat wherever you're comfortable. I'd also encourage everybody to come closer if you'd like. We don't have too much time today, and we're going to keep this really fast and really intimate. The closer you are, the more engaged you'll be in the conversation, and we'll go from there. All right, so some preamble here. I've got an overqualified panel, that's them, and far too little time. So let me quickly lay out a few thoughts, and then I'll guide a discussion with each one of the panelists separately, and then I'll take some questions. And in my estimation, the dominant logic for technological development is based on an increasingly familiar feedback loop, which goes something like this. If we increase data, we increase knowledge, and then we can improve control. Sensors are critical to this feedback loop because they can generate data from daily life without necessarily taxing our attention. In this way, sensors are our gateways to new types of knowledge and new ways of relating to ourselves, each other, and our planet. So today we're going to talk about sensors with an emphasis on their technological affordances and possibilities. Later on, we'll talk about some use cases, but we're actually going to talk a lot about the technical aspects of sensors, and also not just sensors, but the data that come from sensors. And the goal today is to grasp what's to come in the near future, not 10 years off necessarily or tomorrow, but in a time period of tomorrow to 2-3 years or so. That's where we're going to try to keep the conversation. So I want to start with Andrew. Andrew Shu is a technology strategist for Synaptics. Anybody heard of Synaptics? A few people, that's excellent. So he's described Synaptics to me as a human interface company based on touch technology. Andrew heads the concept prototyping team. He's been with Synaptics for more than 15 years. He's led the company's efforts into mobile handset market and developed and marketed touchscreen technology. Cool, all right. Part of what you do is develop conceptual prototypes, and prototypes, as we know as designers, help take us into the near future. So I'm wondering, what are the near future touch-based sensors or sensor applications that are going to open up new possibilities for you as a concept developer and also for users? Or said another way, what kind of touch-based sensors should we be looking forward to? Yeah, why don't you go ahead and pick up a microphone as well. Make sure it's on. No?
Testing.
There you go.
Testing. All right. All right. Once again, it's an honor to be here. I'm approaching this from mostly the electronic standpoint, so it's going to be quite eye-opening to hear what everyone else in the audience has to say about design and fashion as well. Obviously, we try to incorporate that into our prototypes and devices to create high-fidelity prototypes of the touch user experience, mostly as related to mobile handsets and laptops. But one of the areas that we are actively looking into is this concept of wearables.
Which is not something that Synaptics is known for. So how are you're traditionally thought about as being a sensor array that goes on a two-dimensional surface. When we think about wearables, we're thinking about 3 dimensions, our whole body. How are you approaching that?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because a really quick story. When I approached my team about doing a project in wearables, the first thing everyone said is, what, we're going to build a watch? So I think that there's certainly a little bit of sort of discovery that a lot of tech companies need to do in terms of the concept of wearables. I mean, I think that the tech perspective of it all, not to say that I or Synaptics represents the tech community in any way, shape, or form, has always been, oh, it's some electronic gadget that we have to do.
So are you building a watch?
So it's one of the areas that we're looking at, absolutely. And yes, it might have a touchscreen on it if
right.
If you're.
Let's talk about touch and sensor specifically for a second here, because I think that when we think about touch, we don't think about sensors so much. When we're thinking about sensors, we're looking more like what Rachel's wearing with the Misfit Shine, and we're going to get to Rachel in a little bit as to why she's wearing all this stuff. But we don't think about touch as being sensors. We think about touch as being control.
Right.
So how do you conceive of touch as a sensor, which it is, but to a future where touch might be more related to control than, say, gathering data like other sensors.
Right. So all of our touch technologies, in terms of our products, the touchpad and the touchscreen, are the two big examples, are designed to control a device. In fact, one of the value propositions that we had for the touch screen in mobile handsets was the fact that now, instead of having some real estate devoted to buttons that you can never get back, you can actually make a much more economical input control system, because now the output, namely your display, can also serve double duty as your input. So a lot of what we're trying to look at is what is the value proposition for having capacitive touch controls, because the good news now is that almost everyone is familiar with capacitive touch through their smartphones, and you get this magical property, like it almost senses where your finger is going to be without actually touching it, and that's part of the the physics of how the sensor works.
And you're actually going there. And this is not a spoiler, but you're actually taking the two-dimensional sensor and touch into 3 dimensions. Can you speak to the two things that you're doing in that space?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So two of the areas that we're focused on is not just the touch on the surface, but also we're investigating force input as well as proximity control. So we've recently showed some demos, and also if anyone has an S4 or an S5, this concept of AirView.
That's a Samsung S4 and S5.
I'm sorry, yes, the Samsung GS4 and the Galaxy S5. Both of those sensors have the ability to sense your finger at a distance from the touchscreen. We've been able to sort of refine the physics of how we do the sensing to enable that functionality to happen, but it's still the same basic underlying technology as the capacitive.
Now, this is really big. I just wanted to point out how big this is. I mean, control and touch used to be just 2 dimensions. You needed a 2-dimensional panel, and you had to touch the 2-dimensional panel. You're actually millimeter by millimeter pulling it away from 2 dimensions, and you're making touch a 3-dimensional sensor input.
Correct. And likewise, with a slight variant of the capacitive sensing technology, we're now implementing force input too, overcoming one of the big problems that our touchpads have always faced, which is the sensor never really actually knew that you were on the surface. You could infer your finger on the surface, but there was no real indicator other than just some clever algorithms that, if you knew what to do, you could fool those algorithms. But now we can measure force input, and I think that that's going to be a key development in the ability to sense or complement the touch input that we currently offer.
And there's a ramification of this too, which we talked about, which has to do with dynamic tactility. Can you just talk about that really quickly, what dynamic tactility is and what that might mean for us?
So one of the key things that we're looking at, if you recall, phones before the iPhone era had keypads on them, and one of the things you could do with keypads that you really can't do with your touch screen, and if you want a demonstration of that, try doing this while driving, is dial your phone without looking at it reliably. And the reason why you could do that is because the keypad had tactility built into it, just by the virtue of the mechanical design. One of the areas that we're trying to restore as we've moved into the touchscreen space is this notion of tactility. One key example that I always like to point out is that Corning, who makes the glass that is used in almost every smartphone, put out this video called The World of Glass, where they kind of had this sort of future where everything was smooth surfaces, and I went, hey, my goodness, that's really frightening, because I don't, as sleek as it looks in the demo, in the video, it's not my world, in the future. I mean, I want surfaces that I can touch. Everyone loves, warm surfaces.
Texture,
and texture, yes. But certainly from a pure safety standpoint, I mean, the biggest issue that we face right now in terms of, driving is texting while driving. And, certainly that problem has gotten much, much worse based on smartphones, because you really can't, you have to focus your attention on the screen and use visual cues to know where you're typing. So one area that we're hoping to restore is tactility, and then furthermore, to complement the dynamic control capability of a touchscreen, we want to have dynamic tactility. So wherever you want to put your buttons, obviously your device, you want to be able to respond to those graphical elements of buttons, but also, wouldn't it be so nice to have tactile, feelings of those buttons wherever they appear?
And this is really, really important work because we have this kind of hegemony of two-dimensional screens, and you're taking it into 3 dimensions and restoring actual feeling. Andrew, we're going to come back to you.
Sure.
That was awesome. Thank you. We're going to go to Sean White next, the second doctor on our panel. I think 3 of 4 are doctors. And Dr. Sean White is co-founder, CEO, and CTO of Bright Sky Labs, which develops tools to rapidly edit and share footage taken on GoPros, but presumably any other kind of video. But for now, you're focusing on GoPros. I'll let you correct me in a second if I just miscategorized you. He was most recently a technologist in residence at Greylock Partners, that's a venture capital firm, as well as a visiting lecturer at Stanford, that's a prominent university south of here. Dr. White headed the Interaction Ecologies group at Nokia and was a visiting scientist at the Smithsonian. So, Dr. Sean White, I love chatting with you about sensors because the sensors you work with are optical sensors, and specifically those that help take video and photography. And we don't generally think about video sensors and photography sensors as being sensors, but they're potentially the most well-developed category of sensors that we have. So when we're talking about video or optical sensing, what do we have to look forward to in terms of new improvements of sensors?
Yeah, so that's a fair question. And I'll separate it out into what I think probably happens with hardware and what probably happens with the software and the processing of that, right? So on the hardware side, and the hardware just gets smaller and smaller, right? So in my pocket, how many of you have one of these things? It's a GoPro?
GoPro.
A couple of you. There are
10 people.
Yeah, so there are 8.5 million of these, so there are 8.5 million wearable cameras being used today, which is kind of interesting, right? And it's pretty big, actually, right? What's kind of neat is that the companies that are making them, like Ambarella and TI, have systems on a chip that are about the size of a quarter to do all of that and more, and do all of the processing on board to kind of understand what it sees. So right now we sort of think of a camera as this dumb thing that grabs content, but it actually can do a lot more.
Like what?
Well, it can understand whether somebody is smiling. It can understand if there's a face there. And so in the context of, for instance, clothing, you can imagine something that actually has a meter, and if not a meter, but a small embedded camera, and if it actually sees somebody smiling around you, it changes color or shape. Or if it sees someone frowning, it changes color or shape, right? I mean, the thing that's kind of interesting to me is that a lot of people tend to just think of cameras as something that's grabbing a picture, but there's so much more that we understand. I mean, if you think about what you can understand just looking at something now, for the most part, we have a lot of people working on computer vision algorithms that get pushed into GPUs that can do a lot of that.
So Sean, you just jumped ahead a few steps there, which is that what we can learn from cameras is based upon the way that we process the data that comes from them. Yep. Let's just stay on the actual technology for a second there.
Yep.
And let's talk about what's happening to the technology, in terms of frame rates.
Yep. So
optical densities.
And so most of you are probably familiar with like 30 frames per second, right? Which is what you normally see. There are cameras that work in the millions of frames per second.
What does that give you to work in millions of frames per second?
Well,
and how?
That's right. I can see Rachel over here is like, oh, good Lord. We need lots of bandwidth for that. So one of the things it gets you, and I will go back to processing a little
Sure,
bit,
go ahead.
because that's what it changes is that, for instance, this actually is something that you even mentioned when we were talking earlier. You can see not just that someone has smiled, but the path in which they smile.
That's right.
Which tells you a lot about their identity. It tells about how they're feeling. It tells you about the subtleties of it.
These
right?
interstitial moments which we generally
exactly
erase.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, something that's even running, you can get a 640 by 480, which is sort of the regular VGA camera sensor, right? You can get that running at 44 kilohertz, which is how we hear. And being able to process something in that same frame rate is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The other thing that's kind of interesting is then the range of color that we get. So it's one thing to say we can create all of these things that do incredible frame rates. And by the way, if you go really fast, then you get really small. So you have a camera that's running at 1 million frames per second. It's actually a much smaller resolution, like around 128 pixels square, right? But even what you get is interesting. We get things now called light fields, right? So if you've seen some of these cameras like the Litro that can look through a gate or look around a corner, some of the work that Ramesh Raskar is doing at the Media Lab, right? These are things where if you imagine all the light that's bouncing around us, all it needs to do is just be sensed, right? And as we get cameras that are more sensitive, run at higher frame rates, get a greater range of the frequencies of light, we actually get more in there. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that you can go back down to a single pixel. So again, I guess that for some of the people here who are actually thinking about clothes and fabrics and things, you can imagine something that actually just grabs a color, right? A single pixel. But that color is kind of interesting. You can do something with that color, especially if you can change what's around you. You could change the whole room to be the color of what he's wearing right now, or at least the pattern of what he's wearing, right?
So it's a really big, I just interrupt, sorry, to say that it's a really big thing that Sean, who has spent an entire career in using every type of sensor, is now so interested in optical sensors. And I think you're illuminating that we're not just talking about photography and video here, but you're not just focusing on video sensors, you're focusing on wearable video sensors. And I think that that is something unique to the space. Can you just comment on what draws you to the wearable component of the videography?
So the reason I like
get that mic back up there too.
So the reason I like wearable video in particular is it's a point of view that we don't normally have, right? So most of you have this camera in your hand, right? And wearable video actually is an egocentric perspective. It's very different than the kinds of things you have. If you've ever seen a GoPro video or any other kind of wearable camera video, it's very different, right? Because it moves with the attention of it moves with the head of the person, not yet with the attention of the person. That's actually distinct, right? But there are prototypes for doing things with the attention of the person as well. So what I like about it is that it actually is much more closely tied to the human. It's tied to who we are. It's tied to our identity. Whereas the thing in our pocket is a little too conscious for me. The other thing I kind of think is interesting is not just from the point of view of the wearable camera, but any of these wearable or deployable cameras, the things that aren't just your iPhone or your Galaxy, is that when they are deployed or when they're wearable, when they are in these other points of view, when they're in drones or things like that, there are these areas that you've never seen before. There are these visions you've never seen before. And a friend of mine, Rachel Strickland, sort of introduced me to this notion of the Kino eye, right? The sort of moving eye, the eye that sort of can actually capture from all these different places. And it's not just the point of view from the hand, it's the point of view from the bottle. It's the point of view people put these things on skateboards. They put them on children. They put them on surfboards and seals. They put them in toilets. They put them anywhere where yes, that's right. The dishwasher, right?
Yeah. So we have a multiplication of points of view, which is kind of incredible. We have a kind of a finite population of people, but a multiplication of points of view.
That's right.
Which builds empathy, it builds awareness, and even the inner life of objects. We begin to empathize with objects and environments in a way that we couldn't before. Thank you, Sean. Let's move to Steve. Steve Zadig, Vital Connect, co-founder and chief operating officer of Vital Connect, which develops high-end, clinical-grade, general-purpose biosensor patches that are worn for 3 or less days at a time. Steve's the principal source of the vision for Vital Connect's applications, and he has more than 40 years of operational and business experience with startups and pre-IPO companies. So that was a mouthful. I actually want to repeat that again so you know what Vital Connect is. High-end, clinical grade, meaning you can use it in a doctor's office. General purpose, meaning you can use it for anything. Biosensor patches, meaning it's reading our biocentric information.
Steve, you should show.
Yeah, do you want to rip your shirt off there?
I'll show you my shirt, but so we have 2 versions. We have a consumer grade, which is got to look cool. It's not who you are, but how you look. And then we have a medical grade that is for more. It disappears on your body, basically.
Can we pass those around as I'm interrogating you?
Uh-huh.
Okay, not to the panel, to the audience.
Oh, I know.
The Wi-Fi hotspot.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. There's more power in there than the Apollo space capsule.
Is that right? Is that right? Okay, so what sensors does Vital Connect have? And when I say what sensors, I mean these specific ones that the audience is going to be groping.
So basically, we're interested in clinical grade sensing to help people in health and to age and to high performance athletics and things like that. And so unlike some of the other devices that are worn on the wrist or other parts of the body, we're basically around the chest, around the heart.
What sensors are inside that actual patch?
So inside the actual patch is a single lead ECG, which is basically 2 electrodes, a high precision thermistor, triaxial
ECG is?
ECG, electrocardiogram. So basically just to measure your heart signal, right? So that we can derive a lot of things from that. And then we're measuring your skin temperature. We have a 12-bit accelerometer in there so that we can measure both your posture, your motion. We're the first FDA-approved automated falls detection device. There's an altimeter in there so we can see if you're climbing stairs. We thought maybe we could see if you were falling down, but for short people, it doesn't work so well for us, so I apologize. That's basically it. And then what we do is we have a lot of processing power in there. So we then fuse these basic data streams so that we can then derive higher resultants by putting things together. And so an example for that would be if you had an aging parent that was remote and you were concerned about them, you could have them wear the patch. You could see if they were laying in bed in the morning, how they got up, what their body temperature was. You could see if their heart rate accelerated, but if you got worried because you saw it accelerate and they were laying down, of course you'd want to call the neighbor lady or call the doctor, or the system would call the doctor for her. And then ultimately, if you saw mom climbing the stairs, you'd call her and say, "Atta girl, I love you, mom," and keep it up, right? So the context of this data is very, very important. And
so before we talk about all those applications, and these are really important ones to discuss, let's just keep our attention on the actual patch itself. Why a patch? I think people want to know. You're working on a patch. Rachel's associated with a company that has, it's a kind of a general purpose device as well, but why a patch? And what affordances does that give you? What are the pros and cons of the patch?
Well, I think, what you have to come to grips with is that location, 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 right? So where you are on the body is going to drive the algorithms that you develop, and so we look at the torso as being a very stable environment. There's a certain amount of predictability there. We did want to see heart-related issues such as arrhythmias and other things like that. So to put something sticky on the skin is problematic, and it really means that you're going to have a use case that's periodic, but it's going to give you the highest accuracy. It's going to give you the fastest response time. It's going to afford you a lot of benefit in what we would consider to be clinical accuracy of these data points. And so that, by its nature, defines how you're going to go and design the product, how comfortable it has to be, but then you have to deal with all sorts of things like skin sensitivities, body hair,
So if I can just read implicitly to what you're saying here, I mean, we wear all sorts of wearables.
Right.
Some of them can give a characterization of the individual, but if you're really getting to a place at which this is mission critical information, you might need to step up to something that has a more stable read of the biocentric data in the form of a patch.
Right. I mean, I think that we want to look and, in a sense, create your biometric fingerprint, right? So we want reproducibility. We don't want the risk of extra motion coming in. Or am I wearing loose-fitting clothes today if I happen to be wearing one of Rachel's devices and it's flopping around a little bit? Or if it's something on my wrist and I'm cheering for the team or going to the Beyonce concert next and waving my hands around, did I just fall down? Am I having a heart attack? Who freaking knows, right? So we tried to pick a point on the body that gave us the best information with the most stability and reproducibility for that individual.
And if anybody's going to the Beyonce, Jay-Z concert later and plans to have a heart attack, we can get one of the patches.
Yeah. Exactly.
A patch that currently has electrodes, accelerometer, altimeter, processor, memory device. What can we expect to see in this patch in the future? What kind of, in the next couple years or so, what would be plausible additions to the sensor array which already exists in the Vital Connect?
Yeah, so I think that, we've already done development work on hydration, or what we call fluid status. So we're going to be able to see how hydrated you are, or super hydrated in case you had a chronic disease like CHF, where, fluid and edema is a very important thing. We're going to be able to, we're basically plumbing, right? So we're basically going to see the heartbeat. We're going to see the delay time till we see the blood cells move in the capillary we're observing, and we're going to be able to determine your mean arterial blood pressure. So if you're hypertensive, we're going to be able to tell you how your blood pressure is. We're going to be able to associate that with what you ate today, or how stressed you were, or what your activities were. So we're going to be able to very proactively see the status of your health, your progression towards better health, or digression towards worse health. We have a partner that we do gait monitoring, which is
Can you say who they are?
GE, little company. But anyway.
But this is interesting. Can you say, we do this, but indeed you have a general purpose device and you don't do anything.
But see, the problem is, not the problem, the opportunity is that we've never been able to continually measure people in real time throughout their lifestyle. So we found out that we were very, very good in measuring stress, and we have an algorithm for that. We found out that rather than going and spending $2,000 for a sleep test, you can put on a patch in a single night, and we're 95% accurate, because we've seen all these signatures, digital signatures of the human body that nobody's ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's opened up a huge opportunity for all of us, both to manage our health, manage our lives and our stress. it comes at a cost. You have to stick it on your skin, and so that's
not such a terrible cost. Last question for you, Steve, is what are the pros and cons of a general purpose device? I mean, I kind of poked fun of the we part, that you make a general purpose device, but you have a suite of designers and companies who are taking your device and then adapting it for specific niche uses. What would be the pros and cons of the approach that you're taking?
Well, I mean, obviously you're trying to be good at a lot of things and not a specialist in one thing. And a lot of these ecosystems are very, very complex and fragmented. So to get all the solutions in place and get to the point that you have to make some money sometime to pay for your research and development, that can be difficult in a general purpose device. That said, if you want to get the cost down so we can all wear these for $1 a day, then you have to get a lot of scale. So you want to touch a lot of different markets. And so that was the decision that we made, which was to be a general purpose device and then engage with partners like the little company GE. So.
Yeah. And this, how many designers are in the house? I'm a designer. A few? Oh, a half, I would say. I mean, this speaks to what the role of a designer is ultimately, is you're taking these incredible sensors that these people are making, but then adapting them to a niche population. And as designers, we're the ones who are in best touch with the niche population and adapting them appropriately. Steve, thank you. How'd you know? Rachel Kalmar is a data scientist at Misfit Wearables. You're a chief data scientist, right?
I am
singular data scientist. There you go.
In the US,
the data scientist at Misfit Wearables and founder of the 1,000+ person sensor meetup group that discusses sensor technologies and their applications. She has a PhD in everything, including neuroscience from Stanford, and is alum of Rock Health Singularity University and the Stanford D School. Sorry to put you on the spot. Can you stand up? Spread your arms out. Let's see your wingspan. Okay, so Rachel is known for wearing dozens of wearable devices, and it's not because she's trying to make a statement or is an exhibitionist, but it actually is fundamental to your approach to your profession and sensors. And so I thought it'd be really cool just for you to explain what the benefit of wearing all the devices is.
Sure. So I'm wearing 30-something devices right now, and I view this less as something where I'm studying myself and more about studying the device ecosystem. So we know that all of these things count steps. That's great. I don't particularly care about steps. Some people do. And if you do, fantastic. There are so many devices. But what I'm more interested in is figuring out how do we ultimately make these devices more useful. And a lot of my interest in wearing these for now is to understand what is the data like, what are the signals like. It's fine to write a blog post about how you wore one of each device for a week and this is how they compare. But if you want to compare data across devices, you really want to know about variability within a device as well. And so for every blog post that says we wore a Jawbone Up and a Fuel Band and a Fitbit and a Misfit Shine, I also want to see the blog post that says I wore 5 Fuel Bands and this is how they compare. And it's hard because you can't physically have many of the same thing in one place. I try, like this carabiner that has 4 shines here, and I'm trying to understand variability across devices, within a device, across different wearing positions. All of these things also have a very limited view of what you're doing. None of them measure my activity as a person. They measure the activity of whatever body part they happen to be on. And so I have people that say, you know, I wore my Shine or my Fitbit biking and I just didn't get any credit. It's like, well, is it on your wrist? Your wrists just don't move that much when you're biking. These things are not that smart yet. They're accelerometers. And so I always tell people that if you want to get the most credit from these devices, put them on the body part that moves the most in the activity that you're doing. And depending on the different device, some of the algorithms are tailored for that, some aren't. At Misfit, we definitely did a lot of trials with different wearing positions and different activities, but still, your wrists don't move when you're biking, so put it on your foot.
So the analog world, we were saying this before, the analog world is incredibly messy, and we're trying to take an incredibly messy analog world and turn it into something that's very clean and digital, but at this point in time, sensors are messy like the analog world, so let's not think that sensors can somehow turn a messy world into a clean world. Like Vital Connect, Misfit is a kind of general purpose array sensor. You can put it anywhere, presumably. What sensors are currently on the Misfit? What can we imagine will be on it relatively soon?
We have an accelerometer and Bluetooth, so it connects to your phone. I view all of these as like the early days of cell phone cameras, which sucked, but the best camera is the one that you have. And similarly, an accelerometer is not terribly interesting. You can measure movement, but the best data is the data that we have. And so I would love to have data like you have, but I'm not going to wear a patch every day. And so I view kind of Vital Connect at one end of the spectrum and companies like Misfit at the other, which is, our goal at Misfit is make this wearable, because if people will wear it, then that's data that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I view a future where the two approaches, like Vital Connect and Misfit, converge, where we can reach a point where we can have both, but we're just not there yet. And so for now, we're trying to figure out what makes people want to wear a wearable, what makes it valuable, what are the reasons why people stop wearing them. And so for Misfit, the goal was to make it something kind of more fashionable, something that's waterproof, something where the battery lasts a long time, and so to lower the barriers to actually wearing it.
And interestingly, what's just to connect to what Sean was saying earlier about the importance of the actual processing of the data, we were talking earlier about how Misfit is increasing its activity for processing other wearables data. That you guys, because of your simplicity, your intentional simplicity of only having an accelerometer that's only in that form factor, you've gotten really good at making meaning from it, which means that for people who have a lot more data, you have an advantage, you have competitive advantage over making more meaning. Can you speak to that for a second?
Sure. I'd say that we're definitely, future products will have other sensors as well, but we started with the simplest. And the real goal is to figure out, like, how do we integrate multiple sources of data, especially data sources that might potentially be conflicting. Like, all of us have GPS on our phones, and we all have accelerometers, maybe that we're wearing on our wrists, etc. How do you know which of those sources of data to take? If you're on a treadmill in the gym, you should only be listening to the accelerometer. But if you're riding a bike and you have your accelerometer on your wrist, then you should only be listening to GPS. And those are kind of the clear-cut end cases where you only want to listen to one or the other. But what do you do when you have potentially conflicting sources of data? And so that's, as a field, what we're trying to look into. And I think it's awesome to start when you have control over the whole ecosystem and know exactly what kind of data you're getting. But the world that we're moving towards is API integration of multiple different sources of data from multiple places. And so having an understanding of variability is really important, especially if you want to start combining it in a meaningful way.
So I'd like you to use the word plumbing, so that we have two people who've used the word plumbing on the panel, because when we were talking about the data ecosystem before, you said that what we effectively need is better data plumbing. Can you just speak to what that means from an ecosystem perspective for data, and then we're going to open up to the audience, so audience members, get your questions ready.
Sure. So I view as where we are now as different device companies, as little homesteads on the prairie, and we have our own outhouses and our own wells, and we have our own plumbing set up internally, but what we don't have is really municipal utilities. And so in order to get to the next stage, we need to start laying those out. And yeah, people are starting to have APIs. There are lots of APIs out there, but is the data that I push out there from one platform or pull in from one platform really the same as the other? If you're setting up municipal utilities, you need to make sure that the water line always goes to the water line and not to the sewage line. And we're just at this stage. I also like to compare this to the railroads. Before the railroads, there was no standardization of time. Like, every city set their time independently, and it was only when we had railroads coming through that we needed to unify and standardize time across different locations. And that's kind of the stage we're at right now with wearables. There are lots of sexy things to be done, but first there's some very unsexy things to be done, and that's we need to be working on both. We have no motivation to be working on plumbing if we're going to move to another part of the world soon. But we also need to make sure that all of our data is interoperable. We know how to interpret it, because if we don't, then we don't really have anything.
Cool. Thank you, Rachel. All right. We're going to allow everybody to talk now, out of turn or in turn. Sean, go ahead and just give me a sense of hands who has questions or who are incubating questions at the moment. One in the back, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, great. So Sean, go ahead, and then just I'll choose.
Okay,
One.
there was just one other thing I wanted to
Go
add
ahead.
to something Rachel had said, which was, and it was earlier, and she was talking about how there's a Bluetooth module in that, right? And one of the things we don't talk a whole lot about sensors is that all of this stuff, the stuff that Steve's doing and the things that Andrew might do and the stuff that Rachel's been doing, the stuff that we have here, is enabled by some changes that only happened in the last few years, which is getting these very small wireless modules that are systems on a chip, right? So that you can only spend a couple of dollars putting that together and sticking it in this cool little form factor, right? And that didn't exist more than 3-4 years ago. And what's kind of neat from the point of view, I hope, for designers is that you can actually play with those, and there are small modules that let you kind of prototype with that. And even LittleBits has some neat stuff that's out now for doing that. And so all this talk about sensors and the data plumbing and all that, it's important to think about the wireless aspects of this as well, because it actually lets you do some of this.
Thank you for adding that. I mean, low power wireless. I want to take one from the. Sorry, Rachel, go ahead. And Andrew.
I was just going to add, I mean, it's the most unsexy thing in the world. It's the connectors that are going to kill you. And the wearables equivalent is the wireless connection. I mean, there's Ant Plus, which is, I think, one of the low power standards that's mostly used in the sporting industry, but certainly low energy Bluetooth. Those are the things that, how do you connect your electronics to your wearable device? If it's going to be clothing or some other, or how do you communicate back to the host computer? Those are things that, that's why they have IEEE 65476 and ISO 25 billion, and those, that's sort of the next arena of development, at least within the tech community.
Which goes to Rachel's standardization point. Go ahead, Rachel, and then audience.
Yeah, sensors themselves are not new. It's the connectivity that's new. And I can't believe it didn't come up yet, but the Achilles heel of all of this is battery life. Everything any of us is doing is a trade-off with battery life. You can't have all of these sensors and devices that last a year because of the battery. So we don't really have a great solution of how to power these devices right now. You can make trade-offs, but everything is a trade-off with battery life.